makes their own decisions and everybody makes their own choices, but they're not the only ones that suffer the consequences.
Jill Duggar and her husband, Derek Dillard, are ready to share their story. Their new book, Counting the Cost, promises to reveal the unedited truth about the Duggars.
For as long as I can remember, there was this sense of bewilderment with people looking at our family and just seeing all of us lined up in red dresses, you know, out at wherever, and are they all yours?
Welcome down the rabbit hole, friends. When we last left off on this amazing New York Times best-selling book, we were halfway through chapter 5. Josh had just been sent off to rehab for a second time regarding the Ashley Madison scandal, which I have to say, like, I'm sure it was a very expensive, very nice, posh rehab. And I've always thought that they should do like reverse rehabs, which would mean like instead of sending Josh to rehab, it's like Anna and her kids get to go to rehab and be taken care of, and tens of thousands of dollars get spent on their stay. And then they get like medication, someone cooks all their meals for them, they can be exposed to a beautiful environment where everything's taken care of. It's like rehab for the people who had to deal with the culprit of everything. I mean, honestly, and I've been there in my own life. Like I shared with you guys, I've always been a member of Al-Anon because there are a lot of alcoholics in my family. And it's like the people around the person who is an addict have suffered so much, not to take away from what's going on with the addict, but I often think like the spouse of the addict or the child of the addict is like truly victimized. And if anyone needs a rehab, maybe it would be them. Just my opinion. Okay. But anyway, Josh is the one who goes to the $1,000 rehab. And then Derek and Jill, they come back from El Salvador to visit with their family, and everything feels so different. And this is when things really start to change in the book and in Jill's life, obviously. All right, so once they arrive home back to the United States, they're doing some midwifery things, and I think also it's like Jill will have to go through a series of exams, and Derek has something else that he's doing back in the United States, but then they plan to go back to their missionary work. JimBob calls a big meeting of the entire family to meet with executives because, as always, their life is going to be dictated by what TLC needs from them. And here's what the executive from TLC says. "We don't want to punish the victims," she said, looking around. "So we've been trying to figure out how to get the show back up and running. At the beginning, we're going to focus only on the older kids who are adults, but especially those who are married and have moved out of the house. Eventually, we might be able to come back around to showing the younger kids and your parents, but Josh will not be on the show. We cannot have him be a part of it at all." So, of course, this was a difficult meeting. Jill specifically states like everybody kind of looked over at Anna, and Jill writes, "Anna sat silent and still, like a rabbit, hoping a hunter would just move on." All those people who talk so much shit about Anna, she's talked about very little in this book, but the sense I get is that there's nothing but pity for her. "Before we continue," said the network representative, "we want to make sure that you guys are on board." All right, so now everybody's going to spend a lot of time at the big house talking about how they really need Jill and Jessa and anyone else who gets married to like head up this show. And it's going to be really important that the older kids be a big part of what's going on here. But for Jill, she has conflicting feelings now. She says that she still wants to be helpful to her father, but she's starting to feel like, look, Derek and I don't foresee the show being a big part of our future. And that, quote unquote, the mission field was where our hearts belonged. But they went around kind of in a circle, and so many of the siblings just voiced a lot of support for the show. And when it was time for Derek and Jill to say their piece, they said, like, their life is complicated on the mission field. It's dangerous down there. He added, "If we draw too much attention to ourselves or the mission, it could cause problems. We wanted to help, but we made it clear that our involvement would likely look different." And it kind of sounded like TLC, or the representative from TLC, was like, "We're willing to work with you," is kind of where they left it. But then lastly, the last thing about this meeting is that the rep made one final point. She said that if they were going to go forward with the show, they would need Anna to appear in the first episode, talk about her life and what has happened. We can't just skip over it, is what they said. Are you going to be okay with that? And Jill writes, I felt for Anna. She'd been through so much already, and now it was going to get worse. So sad. Anna, like I said, where's her rehab? Her rehab basically includes staying at the Duggars' house in the girls' room with her kids, raising them on her own, while Josh gets to go to a facility where he's taken care of. The next part of the chapter is a little bit about the fundraising that Jill and Derek had to do for their missionary work in El Salvador. They ended up using the same consultant that JimBob was using to kind of help them figure out how to do the fundraising and handle the money from it. His name was Chad. And he was involved with the show. So now everything's kind of still tied in with the show and their father. And you can see how this is going to be very complicated for them. But they also talk about a time in which Jill became very scared and her safety was potentially at risk down in El Salvador. And she and her son had to hide in a closet for a short period of time. And then they ended up being able to figure out what was going on and get rid of the threat that was located there in the area, because kidnappings were a real issue in that area, especially for someone who was white and clearly from the United States. She also acknowledges that around Christmas time, her father and their siblings, they had an annual trip to El Salvador that they would do. So they came down to visit Jill and Derek, and they brought Jeremy, who is now courting, or not courting yet, actually not courting, but was getting to know Ginger, her sister. And she does bring up here that they had gotten an initial financial, a large burst of financial support to their fundraising donations, and they were really excited about that. But then after they left the United States, those donations started to dwindle, and they didn't have very much TV left, and fundraising was becoming difficult, and it was very complicated for them in many ways. They didn't even have steady TV or internet access there, so they couldn't really spend a lot of time working on that. And people were criticizing them about needing this money. And Jill does say here, we wanted to go on the internet and tell people we're volunteers, we don't get any money from the show, but we were told to stay quiet about this. I knew we had to stay quiet about it. So it just felt like another situation in which the show was kind of screwing Jill and Derek over, because now people are assuming they have plenty of money. Why would they need donations? But from their point of view, they don't even realize that JimBob has all this money at this point. So they're kind of thinking we're volunteering for this show. This is nothing for us. But when JimBob comes down, he's aware that Jill's kind of been living in circumstances that are hard. And so he ends up bringing down, I think, a washing machine, a rice cooker, and several other things, necessary items like diapers and stuff. He ends up getting all these little things for Jill and setting it up in her house with his sons. Okay, so then JimBob and the family, they leave and go home after Christmas, and this is when Jill and Derek finally start talking to each other about how they don't think they really want to do this show anymore. They think it's a bit unfair, that financially they are struggling, and they're not really, they were saying that the fundraising for the ministry, it was separate from their personal finances. So personally, they're really struggling on top of what's going on with the ministry. So finally, Derek ends up talking to JimBob about it, and he flat out says, do you think we could maybe see some kind of income from the show at some point? And JimBob makes it clear to Derek that from the very beginning, this show has been a ministry for their family, and that's what we signed on for, and that's what Derek signed on for by marrying Jill. He becomes really dodgy about all the questions that Derek asks him, and it seems that Derek is very forthright. He is basically I think we need to see some income from the show. It takes a lot of time and energy from us. And, we've also filmed for the show when it came to giving birth. This is a lot to ask from a couple. And I was shocked that allegedly in this Conversation. JimBob literally says the following. Jill writes, Pops paused, his jaw set tight. We used to pay Josh, but decided not to do that after a while because it wasn't a very good idea. So it's never specified when were they paying Josh, how much were they paying him. So he was the only one ever getting paid? Ridiculous. Maybe like, did they decide it was a bad idea when he got sent back home from Washington, D.C., for doing horrible, awful things? So he, at some point, was getting paid for the show. And JimBob goes on to say, Michelle is the one that has had all these kids. We wouldn't even have this show if it weren't for her. So his argument is that he's only going to pay Michelle and Josh, but he's going to use all the money to buy planes and big automobiles and construction equipment for his sons. Like, that seems Michelle's the one who the show is really all about. She deserves the money, but let me just take some of that money and buy some more planes with it. Okay, and then Derek, very calm and rational, he responds with like, yes, that's true, but we've also added a lot of value to the show and we've done a lot to contribute. And the show is called Jill and Jessa Counting On. So Jill kind of explains that there's sort of like a game of chess between her dad and Derek doesn't back down, which I don't think JimBob's ever had anyone approach him like that. And they go on about it. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You'll have to get the book to really get the ins and outs of it. But basically at the end, Derek is like, I understand what you're saying, but we would be forever grateful if you can figure out a way to speak to everyone about how we can get some financial compensation from this if we're going to be giving so much of our time and energy to it. And Jill talks about how she had a lot of like shame and fear after the conversation. She had difficulty sleeping that night. Derek slept fine. And, she felt badly about having to even ask for this kind of help from her dad. As we go on in the book, Jill introduces us to a lot of challenges that she faced in El Salvador. For example, they had people that they were close to who went missing and were likely murdered. And it was very hard for them to be a part of this, to see that these wonderful people were losing their lives down there. And it may also have to do with their interaction with the church as to why they were being targeted. So she just talks about, she tries to pay some like homage to these people that meant a lot to her and Derek while they were in El Salvador. So Jill and Derek are down in El Salvador, like doing the real work of the Lord, if you like really believe in all that, because they're actually working with people who don't have any money, don't have access to anything that they need. So they're doing like hard labor in certain ways, but they're getting emailed by the network, specifically Chad, being told that they need to take a break from the missionary work and fly up to Texas to do some kind of like shooting for promotional material such as commercials and all of that. Derek and Jill had made a commitment to stay in El Salvador, like specifically the person who was in charge of the mission asked them to commit to it, to stay and be there for, I don't even know what the period of time was, but they were basically committed to not going back for Christmas. This became a huge area of conflict between Jill and the network executives. They wanted her to be there, and they're like, this show is about you, so you have to be there. But Derek pushed back. He basically said in several emails and phone calls, we don't have to come back. Jill isn't obligated to anything. Jill and I have never been anything but volunteers. And this is when Chad, this guy Chad that's always around, shoots back. Jill has a contractual obligation. She has to return. And this is when the cat, because Jill finds out that she has signed a contract with TLC in which it looks like she's getting paid and it looks like she works for them and she's required to do these different things. And this is the piece of paper that JimBob Duggar slid to her on the day of like her wedding and said, like, just sign this real quick. She's in shock. Derek is also in shock, but kind of like, well, you're not going to be held to that contract because you had no idea what you were signing, and this is wrong. And we can talk to your dad about it, but we are not following. We're not abiding by this contract. and they refused to go up and do the promotional stuff for Christmas. When the time came around, Christmas time when the shoot was going on, suddenly Jill started receiving phone calls from her dad, but she refused to answer them. And this was like really new for her. And she says that saying no to this Houston trip felt like torture, but Derek and I had been doing it for weeks now, and we were committed to standing firm. When she does finally end up talking to JimBob, he puts a lot of pressure on her and Derek and says, like, we really need you. The show is called Jill and Jessa Counting On. And Jill says, like, I didn't want to hurt my dad. I didn't want to hurt the network, but this is the reality we're dealing with. Like, we made a commitment to stay down here and do this work. This is the real missionary work rather than being on TV. Like, we're doing real work here. We're required to be here, and we're staying. And in the last phone call that they had with JimBob about all of this, Jill says that his voice, his tone had changed from trying to persuade them to trying to guilt them into doing it. And this is where JimBob finally says to Jill, is this you or is this Derek who is being the problem here? I'd never heard Pop say anything like that before, and it pierced like a dagger. And it pierced like a dagger to hear him try to pit us against each other like that. I was speechless. This isn't you, Jilly Muffin. Is Derek behind this? Are you having problems financially? Are you depressed? I could feel Derek tensing beside me. Pops, he said. So he's on the call too, and they're still saying this. Pops, he said, his voice calm and controlled. We really aren't trying to ruin anything. We wish we could help, but we've made a big commitment here. And JimBob responds like this. If you don't come back for this filming thing, everything's going to get messed up. We just got the show back and going again, and we need to be real careful not to rock the boat with the network. They can't film the promotional material for Jill and Jessa Counting On without you, Jill. Just think about it. If you don't come to this shoot and TLC cancels the show again, everything is going to look at you and know that everyone is going to look at you and know that it's your fault and that you could have stopped it. Are you going to be okay with carrying that burden? Wow. So, I mean, I think this is where we really start to see, and I think that Jill, like what she describes here is shock. She's shocked that her father is reacting this way because she had been brought up hearing over and over again, this is our window of opportunity, and when it's done, we're done. It's just a ministry that we're doing during our window of opportunity to do it, and if the show leaves and goes, it's God's will. Everything is God. It was always God's will. Things were happening according to God's will. And now it's like, Jill, you got to get up here to keep. Now it's all on you, Jill. It's not about God anymore. We're not taking any chances. We need you to fix all of this or else it's all your fault. So things are changing. JimBob's rhetoric is like drastically changing. And he's probably looking at his bank account and going, I have to pay for Josh to, attend this rehab. I'm going to have to take care of Anna and Josh probably their whole lives and whatever children that they have because Josh isn't going to be able to go get another job. So he's looking at a lot of these things and being like, I'm going to need to keep this show going. And I need to regain my power, regain my control. It kind of flushed away by things that happen with the reveal of what Josh was doing when he was younger. And now I need to reclaim it. And one of the ways to do it is to put all of this on my daughter, Jill. It's so unfair. And this is where we see that Derek tries to really stand up for Jill and take like a firm stance of like, this is our family and we're going to do what we need to do. But JimBob pushes back as well. The last line that JimBob says to them on this phone call is, let me tell you something now. You're going to get sued. You're going to need whatever money you have because you're going to be sued. So I guess he's saying that the network would sue them. I just see a total change in this man as to who she described earlier in the book. It's like he's not in control of his own faculties anymore. He has lost. He's lost it. Yeah, it's like his empire has come crumbling down with all the information that was released about Josh, and now he really would do anything to build it back up again. He does not have a heart of like if this is God's will, like to humble me, then I have to kind of figure out where I'm going to go from here. He's like, no, we're going to make it. We're getting back up there, Jilly Muffin. We're getting back up on that pyramid at the very top. And I need you up there with me right now. So this is a huge change for Jill and for Derek and for the entire family. He calls Jill and Derek again repeatedly, and eventually Jill says they just turn off their phones. They did not respond, and this was very unlike them. They've always been like super responsive. They've always been a family that has like group texts and everyone responds immediately, and they're finally like pushing back and being like, no. But for Jill, this shoots her anxiety up, way up. She has a lot of anxiety about what they're doing. She said that she was in agony, flipping between fear and guilt every few seconds. And I think I feel like this is very reminiscent of what we've heard from Ginger, that she suffered from pretty deep anxiety and depression, always concerned that like something bad was going to happen to her or someone she loved because she was stepping out from underneath the umbrella of authority, or she was doing something inappropriate. And we're seeing it here with Jill as well. So Jill and Derek, they go on with their lives, and it's Saturday, and they talk about how they're giving Israel like his final feeding, and then they hear a vehicle like quickly approach outside. The car doors slam shut, and a voice I'd recognize anywhere called out, "Hey, Derek, Jill, are you there?" I opened the door and saw them, Mom and Pops, coming down the stairs. Her eyes were kind of teary. Pops was behind his phone, filming this family reunion. I didn't know what to say. My sweet Jilly Muffin mask wasn't appearing on command. Derek was stunned too. "We wanted to come and see you," said Pops after an awkward pause. "Didn't we, Michelle?" Wow. They showed up in El Salvador after Jill and Derek like stopped responding to them and said like, "Leave us alone. We're not coming to do pictures for your photo shoot. Like, we're fine." And he put on the mask of, "We just wanted to come and see you guys." Wow. He says, "I realized I was a little harsh," he said. "I'm sorry for some of the things I said." And Jill writes, "I reached for Derek's hand. If ever I needed to be reminded that my husband and I were united, it was then." And that is the end of chapter 5. Okay. So chapter 6 is called No Agreement. In the next chapter, we're going to hear about what happens when Derek and Jill return home from the mission trip. And they do stay for Christmas, even though JimBob comes. I think they end up taking some pictures for him or whatever. But they stay. They hold tight to what they agreed to, and they stay in El Salvador, and they don't come home until August. So in the next chapter, we hear about their return home and a series of family meetings. Okay, friends, that's it for now. Hopefully we'll be hitting up chapter 6 tomorrow. I hope you have a great weekend. Fall is definitely coming out here, and I am so ready for it. Good night to all of you.